When you first read The Flea, it may seem like a bit of an unusual poem by the Renaissance poet John Donne. It makes a strange argument, which is that the flea, this tiny little insect, has sucked the blood, right, sucked the blood of both his beloved and of himself. And if their two bloods have mingled, and in the Renaissance sexuality was often referred to as a mingling of blood, well, then what's the big deal? Perhaps they should have sex as well. And the lady, of course, responds to this, and this is kind of interesting here. The lady seems to respond between the stanzas. So in the first case, between stanzas 1 and 2, the lady kind of threatens the flea, so threatens to kill the flea. And John Donne says, "Oh, stay, 3 lives and 1 flea spare," right? So stay means stop. Don't kill 3 lives, because of course there's the flea's life, there's the lady's life, and there's also his own, because the flea has sucked both of their bloods. So in the second stanza then he goes on with all these elaborate images, and this is why we also call it a metaphysical poem, because we have references to the Trinity and monasteries and all kinds of other things. It's really kind of, the fireworks in this poem. And then he says, well, if you do kill the flea, this wouldn't be very good, because you're going to commit a sin here. Since we are met, since we have kind of come together in this flea as if we have had sex already, then it wouldn't do to kill the flea. And then it seems that she responds by killing the flea. So between stanzas 2 and 3, she does kill the flea. And then he completely changes the argument. He basically says, well, so you killed the flea. Maybe my argument before didn't work so well, but if you can kill the flea and if you don't lose any life as a result, then what's the big deal? In the same way, if you yield to me, if I can have your virginity and we can have sex together, you're not going to lose much honor. So that's basically the argument here, and it seems a little bit odd, doesn't it? It's a very witty poem, very clever, but of course we may want to debate whether we think it would be a successful poem. If you were the lady, would you be impressed by John Donne's wit? Maybe the first thing to recognize here is that this kind of poem about a flea is not entirely unusual in the literary tradition. So we do have other flea poems as well. There's one that seems to have been attributed to Ovid, although it probably wasn't by the classical poet, but it was by a medieval poet. More relevant perhaps to John Donne's poem, in 1583, a collection of poems came out, and this particular collection was called La Puce. It's in French. Let me see here, Madame de Roger, or de Roche, and I'm not French, so I'll leave it up to you to pronounce that. But basically what this collection is about, and Puce here means flea, the flea of Madame de Roche. There were 2 ladies, a mother and a daughter, and a flea landed on the daughter's bosom, in her cleavage, you might say, and a poet decided, hey, we should write poetry about this, because what the flea can do, I cannot, and I wish I could. And so we get this whole series of poems about the intrepid adventures of fleas. And the whole poetry collection is like 50 to 60 poems in this, all about the flea. It includes lots of different plays on words. So we have puce, which means, in this case, the flea. Okay. We also have pucelage. There we go, which means maidenhead or virginity. There we go. And we have pucelle, which is the maid herself. So in our particular poem, we also have loss of maidenhead, and this is why scholars think that, John Donne perhaps was influenced by this, or at least is making similar plays on words as well. Interestingly, the word puce in English means purple-brown, and we do have a reference to the nail being purpled later in the poem. So perhaps that's that's a kind of echo as well. But I don't think we should make too much of this. The basic point here is that these types of poems play with the image of the flea in order to talk about sexuality. But there's a big difference when you read John Donne, because in Donne's poetry, the lady has much more agency. And I have a nice quote here from a critic. This is Gina Philo, who writes, "Rather than fantasizing about uninvited penetration of the woman, then, which you might find in some of these other poems, Donne attempts to gain access to the pucelage de la pucelle, the virginity of the maid, by making an analogical argument about the puce, about the flea, while he seeks to persuade he does not rhetorically invade or rape the female body as the earlier male poets had done." And whether or not that last bit is too strong for those earlier poems, I think it probably is quite accurate. It is definitely true that John Donne is more respectful of the lady. He invites her into the poem. She acts, she responds. And it's doubtful that the argument is entirely convincing. She is apt to kill him. In other words, she has kind of rejected him before, and they seem to have this fun exchange all the time, a kind of teasing and a kind of back and forth. So that gives us a little bit of context. Let's talk about the form of the poem next. So it's a fairly organized poem, and you can actually count the syllables. So you'll see that it has, 8 syllables, 10 syllables, 8 again, 10, 8, 10. There we go, 8, 10, and 10. And each stanza is like that. It's very, very neatly organized this way. The rhyme scheme, basically we have 3 couplets here. So we have A, B, B, C, C, and then we have like a triplet. So we have D, D, and D. And if we think of the numbers of the poem, there's a lot of focus on the number 3. Okay, so the number 3. We can see, first of all, that we have these 3 couplets here, as we said before. Then we have a triplet, right? So we have 3 there as well. We also have 3 stanzas. So we have 3 stanzas in the poem. Okay. Each one has 9 lines. And of course, that's 3 times 3. And then we have 27 lines, which is 3 to the 3rd power, or 3 times 3 times 3. As we said before, we have 3 couplets. We have a triplet. We have references to the Trinity, right? 3 lives and 1 flea spare, and later 3 sins in killing 3. So 3, 3, 3 all the way through. And I think you can see that this creates a beautiful pattern, and it's really part of the cleverness of the poem, of the wit of the poem. So let's go through the poem then from the beginning and make some sense of it. And the first thing he says is, "Mark but this flea." So he's basically saying, hey, notice this flea, right? Pay attention to this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. So little doesn't necessarily mean that the flea is tiny, but this refers to sexuality. So that, right, she's denying him sex, and basically sexuality shouldn't be considered such a big deal. Don't deny me such a small thing. And then he says, "It sucked me first and now sucks thee." Now, I should point out that some critics have argued that in the printed version, if you look at the S's and the F's, the S's often look like F's, okay? Although they don't have this bar across. And as a result, some critics, notably Thomas Docherty in his book John Donne Undone, have suggested that there is a kind of play on the F word. I'm not entirely convinced. Other critics aren't so sure either. So if you read the Cambridge Companion to John Donne, for instance, Andrew Hadfield writes, "Even if this reading is mistaken, the stanza is replete with sexual references." And that's kind of like hedging your bets a little bit, kind of saying, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. If whether or not it's true, there are lots of sexual references. Fair enough. But if you look at the manuscript rather than the printed version, and of course in John Donne's lifetime, this poem really circulated in a manuscript version. Yes, the S's look a little bit like F's, but I don't know how far we should push that. So definitely some question marks around that particular reading. Now, he goes on, "And in this flea are 2 bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that it cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead." So just because this flea sucked both of us, obviously doesn't mean that you lost your virginity. and there's no sin involved. Yet this, right, this flea enjoys before it woo. So woo here has the sense of courts, but courts with a view to marriage, and it's like it jumps right to the last thing, especially in the Renaissance when premarital sex was strictly forbidden. He then writes, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And you can read this idea of swelling in one of two ways. So some critics see this as a reference to an erection. Others see it as a reference to pregnancy. And of course, both of these can apply because the flea represents both of them, right? So there's a kind of sexual suggestiveness here. But of course, if the flea gets pregnant, he's also implying, well, you are not getting pregnant, so rest assured, there's nothing to worry about here. He says, and this, alas, is more than we would do. So going back to this idea of the swelling, some people read this very positively, as in, well, I wish we could get pregnant, so I'm not just in it for sex, right? I'm in it also for a real relationship and children and all this other kind of stuff. And other people read it much more as just sexual innuendo, and he's not quite as serious. So you'll have to make up your mind about that yourself. Then we have the moment where she threatens to kill the flea, as we said before. And now the imagery gets very religious. So we have a reference to the Trinity, as mentioned before. He says, this flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. Okay, so if we are, basically, if we've had sex already in this flea, then it's as if we are married. And this is our marriage bed. And a temple, of course, makes this very holy. So this sexual intercourse becomes very holy. This particular line here, though parents grudge, is often read biographically. So in December of 1601, John Donne got married secretly to Anne More, and sometimes Anne is with an E at the end, so it depends how you want to spell it. But he got married secretly to Anne More, and her dad wasn't happy at all. So her father, Sir George More, had John Donne actually imprisoned for a brief time. He was fired from his job. Things did not go well with John Donne. And there's also some speculation as to whether she was pregnant already and they had to get married quickly to avoid scandal. So lots of question marks around this. But basically what we see here is that parents are not approving of this sexual union, and you are neither, but we are met because the flea has sucked both of our bloods. A cloister, of course, refers to like a monastery, some kind of a religious dwelling. And in this case, he's saying the walls of jet means black, so the flea is black, and it's as if the flea is a monastery or a nunnery or something like that. It's as if you are still celibate, right? Because in a monastery, you're not supposed to be married. So celibate, you're still chaste, living in these walls of jet, and he pulls out all the stops, makes the language really religious, and makes it sound kind of sacred. Use here refers to habit. Okay, so you are habitually trying to kill me. And apt here means inclined or disposed. So you're inclined to kill me all the time. And this, of course, fits with the idea of the courtly lover, which you get from the Middle Ages, right? The lady is cruel, she's always killing him, and he has to suffer and be ready to go through that. So as we go through these lines here, then we see three different sins that she is committing if she is to kill the flea. The one would be killing him because his blood is in the flea, so that's murder. The second one is suicide, self-murder, because her blood is in the flea. And the last one is sacrilege, which is to make something holy not holy. And of course, we've seen all these images where the flea now is a temple and it's a cloister and so on and so forth. And if that's the case, well, then she would be committing sacrilege by killing the flea. At this point, we do need to go back a little bit as well, because this religious language is also actually there in the first stanza, but we may not have seen it. One thing that critics have remarked on is the constant references to this, right? Mark but this flea, In fact, this particular word is used 6 times in this opening stanza. And I'm kind of scanning through here quickly. I probably missed one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's one more. Okay, there it is. And the reason why critics remark on this is because Catholics and Protestants at the time when John Donne was writing were arguing a lot about the Eucharist. And if we think about the Eucharist, we have this phrase that the priest says, right? Hoc est corpus meum. So, hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. This is what Christ said in the New Testament. Eat it and drink of my blood and so on and so forth. And hoc, of course, means this. So this is my body. And the Protestants said, well, it sounds like hocus pocus. It sounds like nonsense, because the Protestants wanted to say, when Jesus Christ says, this is my body, he doesn't mean literally. So we have to think about it a little bit differently. As we read the poem then, it's as if he is saying, hey, this flea, in the same way as the Eucharist, right, is you and me. So this idea of is becomes very powerful. Hoc est, right? Here is this flea, which is you and me. It's like we have communion with each other. Just like when I have the Eucharist, I partake of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So this flea allows for a similar kind of Eucharistic experience. And that seems a bit scandalous. What you could argue then, and certainly critics have made this point, is that the first 2 stanzas have a lot of Catholic references. If we think of cloisters and monasteries, in the 16th century, Henry VIII, the English king who really started the Anglican Church, had tried to get rid of the monasteries. We talk about the dissolution of the monasteries. So this is a particularly Catholic kind of argument, right? And to the Protestant and more, what did it really mean? So John Donne seems kind of self-mocking here a little bit. He uses arguments from all kinds of different backgrounds, and it's as if he takes the flea and treats the flea sucking both their bloods and giving them this sort of shared communion as a kind of secular Eucharist. It's very close to a parody, isn't it? And it's not surprising, perhaps, that Anne More, if we read this biographically, ends up killing the flea in between the stanzas. There's a lovely quote here from a critic who writes, in between these stanzas, the lady responds to his papistical-sounding nonsense, right? Papistical refers to the Pope, with an iconoclast's righteous violence. And iconoclasm is where you want to destroy images and statuary, which the Protestants sometimes did want to do. So in this case, all of this imagery before, which is symbolized by the flea. The flea is like the icon here. It's the image that represents everything else. She squashes the flea, and he's left to change his tune. So in the final stanza then, he addresses her. He says, cruel and sudden, right? You're so quick about this, so cruel. Hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence? We could read this religiously as well. So Christ, of course, was the sacrifice who was innocent, and now it's the flea, which continues the earlier parody, you might argue. Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphst, and says that thou find'st not thyself, nor me the weaker now. So we really see her argumentation in these lines. Okay, I killed the flea. Nothing has changed. If my blood was in there, and if killing it was suicide or murder, something would have happened, but clearly that's not the case. So she not just squashes the flea, but she squashes his argument. At the end then, he tries to turn it around. He says, "'Tis true, neither of us is weaker now. Then learn how false fears be. You were afraid of killing the flea, perhaps? Well, you don't have to be afraid of anything at this point. Just so much honor when thou yieldst to me will waste as this flea's death took life from thee." And he's kind of returning to this idea of signs, right? So we saw before that the bread and the body are connected. Okay, we said before the bread equals the body. So there we go. And in the same way, we can think then of a signifier representing something else, right? There's a signified. It means something. In this particular stanza, he's saying, well, you seem to think that your honor is represented by your virginity. But, okay, maybe we don't have to connect these things quite so closely. Maybe we can get rid of this connection. I can have your virginity and you will keep your honor. So these two things are no longer connected closely, right? It's as if he gives up on the earlier argument, this hoc est, this is, and now he's going with an understanding of how a signifier works, which suggests that we can radically break the link between one thing and something else, which is a clever turnaround for sure. And some people suggest that this is more of a Protestant argument all of a sudden. I don't know if we should read it quite that closely as, this is Catholic, that's Protestant, but it certainly participates in these kinds of debates. Okay, so at this point then, we're left with one final question, which is, well, is he successful? How would the lady respond? I don't think we have to answer that question. I think part of the fun of the poem is simply in enjoying the wittiness. As one critic has written, Donne seems more interested in finding out what he could do with the flea than what the flea could do for him. He's just trying to see what kind of clever argument can I come up with. And if he's going to persuade her, I would suggest, it's not because the logic is so great. I mean, the final stanza is not logical at all if you actually look at it closely. It's not the logic that's fantastic. It's the wit. It's the cleverness of using all these images, all these images of the Trinity and the numbers and so on, and bring them all together and making something that's funny and interesting. So I would suggest that's really the appeal of this poem, and maybe that's what would have impressed Anne more.